Hi, you're listening to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DBS Group Research. I'm Taimur Baig, Chief Economist. Welcome to our 69th episode. I promised a deep dive in global macro in the last episode, and here we go. With great pleasure, we welcome back Mark Sobel to our podcast. Mark is U.S. Chairman at the Official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum, better known as OMFIF. He has been at the forefront of international financial diplomacy for several decades, representing the US at the International Monetary Fund's Executive Board till April 2018. Prior to that, Mark was Treasury Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Monetary and Financial Policy between 2000 and early 2015. He helped lead Treasury preparations for G7 and G20 finance minister and central bank governor meetings, formulating US positions in the IMF, coordinated Treasury and regulatory agencies' work in the Financial Stability Board as well. Mark, welcome back to Kopi Time.
Thank you for having me. I'm flattered that anybody would want to hear my views a second time. So how can I help you today?
Well, you were highly articulate and prescient in your last appearance. I expect nothing less this time either. Mark, you came to the show exactly a year ago, and the Biden administration was just getting going at that time. A year has gone by, and we have been vaccinated and boosted, gone from Delta to Omicron. And on the legislative side, the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Bill passed successfully through Congress, as did the $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill. The Fed, till now, has kept extraordinary accommodation in place. And as a result, we've got tons of job creation, wage growth, and also inflation. So let's start with that. What's your take on all this?
Well, thank you again. You just painted a semi-positive picture. I agree with that. There's tremendous pessimism, division in our country at this time. But I think as you look back on the past year, there are good reasons to be sanguine and see the big picture as positive, with asterisks, of course, and we'll come back to those. You said that the vaccines came online. This was a modern miracle of science that so many people were vaccinated so quickly. It could have been far worse, especially when you look at other plagues in history. US GDP is above its pre-pandemic level. It's close to potential. Unemployment's 4%. It was 15%, I think, at the peak of the crisis. There are lots of debates about the Biden team, but it's much more cooperative and multilateral internationally. I'm sure we'll have words about China and Russia as well, where it isn't so hunky-dory, but okay. Notwithstanding the political divisiveness in this country, even under the Trump administration, there were two fiscal bills passed working with between the Democrats and the Republicans. You just mentioned the Biden bills, the 1.9 trillion bill. So the US has managed to use fiscal policy to compensate for massive shortfall in private demand. And if anything, we overdid it. And the being overdone is seen in the excess savings that Americans have, this 2.5 trillion, I think, which is a little bit more than 10% of GDP, I guess. Now, I believe that the 1.9 trillion bill could have been better targeted and means tested, especially on the personal checks and the state and local government support. But it did provide support for Americans, and we don't have the extensive automatic stabilizers that the Europeans have. And, you know, as our Congress habitually proves, Bismarck talked about sausage making and legislation. Well, it's not a pretty process. The infrastructure bill is a great accomplishment. It's one that eluded Obama and Trump administrations. We need it. We need it to be done well. It will only unfurl over a long time. Of course, there are caveats to this positive story. You know, we'll come back to high U.S. inflation. We as I said, we're a very divided society over how to respond to the pandemic, these epic fights about masks versus not masks. There's this question of the great resignation. Well, we just had great job numbers, and who knows what they mean for labor force participation, but labor force participation appears to be down. We have supply chain vulnerabilities, and who knows about what where those will head. The labor share of income doesn't seem to be rising yet. So you hear about big wage gains, but given the inflation, and the wages don't seem to be keeping up. So putting it all together, I think we've done a good job in mending the pandemic damage. We've helped protect the vulnerable. We've made some good stride forward in our social safety net. We've maintained some demand. And I think we were right to use fiscal policy to extend accommodation, even if it was too much of a good thing. So, on balance, I'm positive, notwithstanding some of the kind of the negative mood one detects in America these days.
Mark, I take your point entirely. I mean, a year ago, things were not looking that great. And now it's like, Janet Yellen's dream high pressure economy, lots of inflation, lots of job growth, and lots of employment. Now we're talking about 5-6% wage growth being not enough to keep pace with inflation. Well, that, of course, is not the best thing in the world. You want real wage growth to take place, but at the same time, it creates this massive nominal expansion of the economy, which at least in the short term helps address debt issues, creates margin for companies and so on. So I can't really see the developments fully congruent with the dismal ratings that the government gets right now, or the administration gets right now. Of course, this takes us to the natural transition toward inflation. Mark, looking at 2022. That's issue number one. The first 4 or 5 weeks of this year has been entirely driven by that narrative. How strong will the Fed go? And how will the whole world sort of adjust to this regime of higher interest rates? And we're seeing Bank of England move. We're seeing even the ECB, which was completely on a stupor, now trying to suggest that some degree of normalization is warranted there. So, and of course, within the US, former officials, current officials have varying views on the transience of inflation, on the Fed being ahead of the curve or not. Your former colleague, Larry Summers, wrote an article in the Washington Post, a series of many articles that he has written, basically saying that the Fed has sort of dropped the ball to some extent. Want to hear your view both on inflation as well as where the Fed is going.
Okay, well, this is a can of worms, and I think one needs to demonstrate great humility in this terrain, and I think critics don't exhibit sufficient humility. There's so much we don't know. There's so much the Fed doesn't know. There's no pandemic playbook for the Fed or crystal ball on what's going to happen with the pandemic. Supply chains is not something any economist is an expert in. And one doesn't really fully understand this skew or the shift in the relative prices between services and durables and whatnot. And then we have energy prices up and down, but mainly up. So a lot of the mainstream forecasts for the US have fourth over fourth 22 inflation going to the 2.5% to 3% range, further towards 2% in 2023. But inflation forecasts keep getting marked up, including core prices, and the risks are to the upside, I think most people would say. We've had some anomalous things pushing up prices in the US. Everybody always mentions used car prices. It's hard to continue seeing that happening at such a pace. But then again, rentals and other things may be adjusting upward. And who knows what's going to go on with the pandemic and supply chain issues. So I think, as you alluded, some people emphasize supply, other people emphasize demand. I think the argument on the demand side is if the economy has a fixed potential, and then you inject tons of stimulus into the economy that takes it beyond its potential, it just bids up prices, and you get inflation. So both monetary and fiscal policy have contributed to inflation from that standpoint, and will need to play a role in its withdrawal. But if the issue is more about supply or relative price shifts, then I guess there's a question about how much monetary policy can deal with the matter, and how much of a forceful role do you ascribe to monetary policy to deal with a supply-demand imbalance. But then again, you have to be worried, well, if it persists, will this cause expectations to be de-anchored, and will this cause a wage price spiral and all that? Now, this year, I know fiscal is going to turn consolidative. So I think if we had a 12% of GDP deficit last year, a lot of the estimates this year are kind of around 5-6%, something like that. So that will take quite a bit of demand out of the economy. I'm not worried about our ability to finance ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. But on monetary policy, again, while it can't fix supply chain issues, it can address demand. We're in uncharted water. At this point, the Fed seems to be signaling for hikes this year or so. They've speeded up the balance sheet, the ending of tapering. We haven't seen what their balance sheet plans will be, but a lot of people think there's going to be a good bit of balance sheet reduction this year. They have said it will be faster. And the Fed has said it's going to be data dependent, which is appropriate because the data are very uncertain. And that will leave the door open to more than 4 hikes or less than 4 hikes if needed. I can't really say if I think, and if I know whether inflation is 50% demand, 50% supply, or 70-30, 30-70, or whatnot. So I think, every meeting should be live if needed, and we'll see what gets done. Let's just say, I think it's hard being a central banker these days, and I wouldn't want to have to be Jay Powell, having to go before the cameras all the time with 1,000 critics waiting in the wings.
But he's, of course, promised to be humble and nimble, which I think is something that you would endorse. Mark, as
Can I say one other thing? Can
Sure,
I say
please.
one other thing? It's about financial conditions in the U.S. I should have said this. I think financial conditions indices are very imperfect and whatnot, but I think they provide useful information. Equities have come down in recent weeks, but I think they're pretty stretched, probably still. We've seen the short rates move up considerably, 2-year, for example, but the 10-year, it's up, but I wouldn't say, I'd say moderately so. Real rates remain very negative. FX is less important component of a financial conditions index for the US than for others because we're such a closed economy. I see financial conditions still as overly accommodated. And I also do think that the Fed in recent years has perhaps overly, do I dare say, coddled markets through its various puts. And so I think the markets need to take on board to a greater extent the evolving shifts in the monetary policy landscape. So back to you.
So 2 follow-ups to that. First is, as we speak, we're speaking in the first week of February, or the second week of February. The Atlanta Fed nowcast suggests that, thanks to the surge in Omicron, the current run rate for the GDP is probably close to 0. It'll probably come back and snap back very quickly, but activities did get disrupted in the first few weeks of the year. And then this is happening at a time when inflation is running at 7%. So we are already at a bit of a weird combination, like a misery index, if you will, would suggest that things are pretty bad. I mean, you could argue that by the time the quarter ends, it'll be not as miserable. Growth will pick up. But is there a risk if the Fed indeed has to signal 4 or 5 rate hikes that the market's ability to absorb that, or the economy's ability to absorb that, is not there, and then we end up with a bit of a stagflationary scenario where growth is low, inflation is high, and that's basically the worst of all worlds?
Growth always bounces around from quarter to quarter, and we did have Omicron and the like. And so, I guess the question you have to ask yourself is, what's your outlook for 2022? I see forecasts 3 to 4, I think, is the number, and unemployment 4%. So a misery index of 7 to 8% is pretty darn good, especially when you compare it with the 70s stagflation. So I'm perhaps a bit more upbeat on this question than you are.
Very good. And on the role of the exchange rate, you just alluded to the dollar not being a major factor in terms of the financial conditions index, but higher interest rates ought to be associated with some degree of stronger US dollar, which also means lower imported inflation. Is that a tool that's useful for the Fed?
In the US, we don't think about the dollar as a tool. The view is the dollar floats, let the markets float. If there is information to be gleaned from the dollar, that obviously factors into the way policymakers think about the stance of monetary policy or macro policy. But I don't. There can be cases where the dollar weighs more heavily on policymakers' thinking. I'm thinking back to the global financial crisis, when there were times when the dollar was really, really weak against the euro, and that might have constrained monetary policy options. But in general, I don't think so. And you could argue, well, if U.S. is raising rates, that's going to make the dollar go much higher. But I personally think the dollar is a bit on the top-heavy side. I think that when the dollar does well when there's a big risk-off environment or there's a big risk-on environment, but if it's somewhere in between, I think conditions can be calm, and the dollar isn't going to be substantially bid up. And let's remember, we have a pretty big current account deficit, and that has to be financed. So when I put it all together, I always say nobody should ever make an exchange rate prediction. Anybody who does is a fool. But I kind of, being foolish, think if the dollar range trades, I won't be all that surprised this year.
I have to say, Mark, when you said that, in the US, we don't really talk too much about the dollar. The former president did talk a lot about the US dollar. I think he was very gung-ho about a weak dollar for most of his presidency, and then at the end,
yes,
somewhat flipped.
I have to defend myself on that. The period when I was at Treasury, kind of running that bit, was 2000 to 2015. So I was of the view that you just don't talk about it, and talking about it will only get you in trouble. And that was a constant of the Bush and Obama administrations. So you are totally right. And I'm reflecting my experiences.
Indeed. I'd like to think that your experience is reflective of the present administration to some extent and their policy framework.
I think it is.
Indeed. Okay, fiscal. We had some momentum building up for Build Back Better, but now it seems to have sort of dissipated entirely. Is that a big deal?
So I think that Build Back Better in name and current form is not going to happen. Almost certainly dead. Months and months of effort, and there we are. And another complicating factor is that there are a lot of legislative priorities. So we need another bill to keep the government open. They're working on a competitiveness bill that addresses China. There's going to be the Supreme Court vacancy. So one never knows what's going to happen in DC politics, but if something is going to happen, it will be scaled back. I've heard some of my friends who follow the Hill say, something 500 billion to $1 trillion. It certainly won't be what the progressives wanted. Now, the politics are extraordinarily difficult. The Republicans will oppose anything. In the Democratic Party, you have the splits between progressives and centrists and differences over what should be emphasized. I have to say, I think the Democrats really badly handled communications about the matter. All one heard at first was $3.5 trillion, and they didn't do a good job of getting into people's psyche what's in the bill and why that would be helpful to them. I think that there was a perception that it was a very activist bill. And given the current inflation situation in America, I think many are just wary about the idea of activism from the government. Now, is it a big deal if it dies? So two answers to that. One, look, it doesn't help the president in his agenda. If he can pull off something, it'll be a win, it'll be good. The perception that Democrats are at loggerheads with one another between the progressives and the centrists is hardly helpful. And Biden is polling low, and so when he doesn't achieve his agenda, that doesn't help him. Now, beyond that, I think you're asking a question about social preference. And, in my view, I think initiatives like child tax credit, universal pre-K, child care support, paid family leave, more climate spending, I think there are issues that the American people could get behind if they were led to do so properly. But again, the odds don't seem to be on the side of passage of even a modified, reduced bill at this point.
Right. Unfortunately, especially in the climate part, I was hoping that this administration would be able to sort of turbocharge some of it. I know that there are some climate provisions in the earlier two bills, but hopefully, at some point, some parts of this bill can be put back in train. Mark, let's sort of switch gear a little bit and talk about international economics. When the Biden administration came to power, I think we never really expected it to undo everything that the Trump administration do immediately. But a year has gone by. Trump-era tariffs have not been touched. CPTPP is not going anywhere as far as the U.S. is concerned. It's going ahead without the U.S. And in the last 2 years, global coordination on vaccine production and distribution, which really ought to have been led by the U.S., has been somewhat patchy. Am I being too pessimistic in my prognosis, or this is how things have been?
Well, nobody who knows me has ever accused me of being optimistic and cheery, but I'm going to say that I think the proverbial glass is more than half full. So in the world of international finance and diplomacy, tone matters. And let's remember that a little more than a year ago, our rhetoric in the US was nativist, it was bilateralist, it was anti-multilateralist. We had a president who threw away a G7 communique, ripped up international agreements, denigrated other countries with less than polite words, and a president who frankly preferred Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un to Angela Merkel and Justin Trudeau. So that is gone. That tone is gone, and rightly so. Biden and his team are working with others. They're trying to be constructive. Look at the role they're playing on Russia and Ukraine and how closely they are working with others. At this point, I mean, the West is more unified now than it probably has been for years. There have been some marginal moves on trade tensions. The Boeing, Airbus have a deal. The Treasury worked out the international tax agreement. Whether Congress passes it is another question. On financial sanctions, the Biden team is working much more closely with allies, trying to work with them, especially on the Russia-Ukraine sanctions, rather than following a unilateralist path. And they definitely are trying to work more closely overseas on climate issues. And then since I'm a old Treasury, ex-Treasury guy, I always have to say, the US remains a very open economy, very open financial system. The strong US economy is imparting huge global demand, and I don't hear anybody complaining about that. So that said, I think it's important. Americans do not want to be the policemen of the world. The Afghan departure will reinforce that. Basically, Americans want to see our country's global footprint reduced. Now, CPTPP is an example of less than desirable constancy between Trump and Biden, in my mind. You'll get no argument from me. I think the abandonment of TPP by the US was a huge, colossal mistake. It hurt us in Asia and only cedes ground to China. And I'd like to see us return, but I'm not holding my breath over that. It's just not going to happen. The Republicans aren't the free trade party of the past. The Democrats have their own fissures on trade. So that's why I'm not even more effusive. But again, I do think that the rest of the world should feel positively about the changed tenor coming out of the United States on international diplomacy.
But we should not hold our breath on the Trump era tariffs. They're going to stay.
I think there are a lot of people that would like to chip away at them, move away from them, but they will do so very, very hesitantly, and perhaps you'll see more exceptions and exclusions and things of that nature. But it's not easy political sailing on the trade front in the United States at this point.
Right. You recently wrote an article, and I really, really enjoyed it. It was a very provocative title: "German and Chinese growth models are outdated." I wonder if it was your editor or you who came up with that title. Let's begin with China. Haven't we been predicting China's collapse for decades? And hasn't it widely flagged structural challenges like excess investment, leverage overhang, aging have been around for a while? So why is this moment in China's economic history an inflection point?
Well, it'll come as a shock to you, but every once in a while I can have a catchy thought, and I actually came up with the title myself. Tough question, fair question, and I'll bet you it's a really important question to Southeast Asia in particular. I always think of the African proverb about when the two elephants fight, the grass gets stomped on, and I'm not calling Singapore grass, but you get the drift. I want to start in a different place. I want to ask a lot of people ask, why is the US being so hard? And to me, I think a fundamental question in thinking about how China's approach to this administration and really rests on the question of how has China changed? President Xi is a very different animal than his predecessors, and much more authoritarian, much more statist, much more controlling, putting power in the Communist Party. Liberal reforms have been set back. So it's a much more aggressive China, in my view, and a lot of the concerns over industrial policy and technological theft, et cetera, are quite valid. These were concerns that were on the plate of the Obama administration. Trump put them on steroids and whatnot. And I think in the past, when the two of us have chatted, we've you've wondered if the Biden tone was that different. And I think that it is different, but that a lot of the substance very much remains the same. Now, why is China different now? Well, I guess sometimes I think about Stein's law: if something can't go on forever, it will stop. President Xi himself said Chinese GDP would double by 2035. So that means growth needs to average 4.75% over this period. But if it's higher at the beginning part, it'll be lower at in the second part of the period. I think there are reasons why things are different now. I think, first of all, the demographic kink is soon upon China. It wasn't a decade ago, but now it's beginning to hit China. China's heavily relied on trade in the past. You and I both know in the early 2000s, there were 10% of GDP current account surpluses. Now, the current account before the crisis was getting close to a bounce, but they still run a trade surplus now around 3% of GDP, and this is in an $18 trillion economy. So I think that global growth is going to slow over this decade. We see potential slowing in fairly modest in Europe and Japan, under 2 in the US. China itself is slowing. So it just seems to me that China, as the world's number 2 economy now, its global footprint is just way too big for it to rely on the external sector as a major support for growth. And that if it does, it's going to cause ramping up of protectionist pressures around the world. The China economists often say that much of the growth over the last 2 decades was driven by the absorption of rural labor. I don't know if that process is complete, but many experts say it is largely completed. Chinese growth has relied on savings and investment, high levels of them, and the efficiency of investment has plummeted. So basically, it's taking over 7% of GDP in investment these days to generate 1 percentage point of growth. That was a 3 to 5%, a decade ago or so. Much of the investment is run through large state-owned commercial banks going to SOEs. And meanwhile, the government is cracking down on the private sector at a time when, according to the recent IMF Article 4 report on China, that the TFP, total factor productivity growth, is under 1%. And I'm one who believes that the private sector is a better engine for growth than state-owned enterprises. So I don't see that as auguring well for growth. Debt and leverage are high. The authorities seem to be wanting to crack down on debt and leverage. They know that if they do so too forcefully, it's going to further cause growth to plummet. So they let their foot off the pedal a little bit, but the overall trend towards restraint, I think, is there. Weaknesses in the real estate sector, even if managed financially, are going to have to put a crimp on a growth. It's 30% of GDP. Consumption growth. So China wants to transition to consumption and services-led growth, but consumption remains very low. I think fiscal policy could play a role in helping build the social safety net to a greater extent in China. But again, I think that the overall direction of fiscal policy is modestly in restraining. So when I put it all together, I think that the future growth drivers could face a challenge. And I kind of wonder whether China's, and this is other analysts have raised this point, will be able to escape this middle income trap. So I hope that, well, and of course, coming back to where I started, US-China tensions, geopolitical tensions are not going to improve the picture. So when you put it all together, that's why I think this time may be different.
Okay, fair enough. And your article was about both Germany and China, because you talked about Germany's sort of history of focusing on heavy industry and large enterprises. And in the context of Germany, you provided a playbook for economic revitalization for the Scholz government. You talked about climate change, digitalization, infrastructure investment are three areas where they can push for growth. So in the context of Germany, my question is, do you think they can deliver? And also in the context of China, why can China grow through climate and digitalization?
Okay. So yes, the article postulated that Germany has traditionally been an export-led economy, and we still see that in its massive current account surpluses. Savings is quite high, personal, corporate, and even public in recent years, while investment's been restrained. And I also noted in the piece that Germany's automotive industry has played a huge role in the economy's growth, and it may face difficult transition periods with the electrification of cars and whatnot. And then, as you said, to help stimulate domestic demand growth, reduce its external dependence at a time of a slowing global economy, which we just discussed, I observed that the new government could help modernize growth model and support the economy through investment in climate, digitalization, and infrastructure. And let's give the Germans credit. The Scholz team understands this, and they have even articulated this vision. One should never underestimate the ability of the German economy to adjust. What it did after reunification was quite impressive. The Greens are in power now and definitely have a climate agenda and the like. Now, you ask, is this will they carry through on it? And I think it could be quite challenging for them to do so. German fiscal behavior is conservative. Perhaps from the standpoint of many Americans, excessively conservative. Of course, one could always ask, who are we Americans, given the way we run our fiscal policy, to comment on anybody else's. But they deserve good credit for their commitment to financial stability. But with negative real interest rates and huge investment needs, it would be a good time to step up investments in these areas. But I think that they're constrained by their conservatism and then the debt brake laws. And while I think they can find some ways to work around the debt brake, they're going to face political and other constraints in doing so. So I expect them to do more. but I'm doubtful about a significant ramp up. Let's just say the current account surplus is 7% now. So that means the savings investment balance is 7%. So let's say they step up public dissaving. Let's say the current account goes from 7 to 5%. Is that such an epic change? And in those circumstances, they'll still be relying excessively on demand from elsewhere to support the German economy. So I think they're going to be politically hamstrung. Now, you then just ask me, well, why can't this be China's playbook? And I think implicitly you're asking me why do I think it could work for Germany but not for China? So this can indeed be China's playbook. And if you haven't read the China Article 4, it's worth reading it, but it describes some of the playbooks that China has in these areas. It's kind of hard. One might imagine why are you talking about infrastructure in China? Because if you've gone to Chinese airports or ridden the train from Beijing to Shanghai, you think, well, pretty darn good infrastructure, certainly relative to the United States. I guess at the end of the day, I mentioned Xi cracking down on the private sector, Xi being more controlling, more authoritarian, the party playing a greater role in the economy. And as an American, I have an innate greater faith in the private sector to deliver innovation than government, even if governments have a role to play in helping catalyze processes of R&D, etc. And again, I think China is changing, and I think that in the end, this direction is going to weaken China's growth potential and productivity. So it comes down to the role of the state, I guess, in my mind.
Mark, I'll share with you two anecdotes. So I spoke with David Victor, who's a professor at UCSD, used to be the climate advisor for Pete Buttigieg during his campaign run. And David's argument was that, basic mainstream economics sort of, falls short in terms of, how to deal with climate change, and the general observation that economists are making on the climate change side, it has to be top down, coming from the government, whether it is carbon pricing or upgrading the infrastructure to deal with climate change and renewables. And the second anecdote that I want to share with you is that, when I spoke with Jun Ma, who's used to be PBOC's chief economist and now represents China in the G20 climate change roundtable, and Jun sort of, models that over 5% of GDP annual expenditure is needed by China to reach 2060 net zero goals. So that's, trillions of dollars literally that China's public and private sector would have to put aside for, again, the green transition. So it seems to me that the zeitgeist of climate change seems to suggest that it should be a top-down project, and China seems to be following along that, which most Western climate economists would argue that is the right way to go about it, not necessarily allow the private sector to figure out how to internalize all these negative externalities from climate change, but let the government sort of dictate what the price of carbon should be and how the transition timetable should be. So that was, just my 2 cents that,
that's fair. It's fair to say that the government has to create the kind of the incentive framework, so carbon pricing and regulation and the like. But at that point, I think private sector is going to have to take over, and we'll see how China does. I wish them the best, and I wish my country would be much more proactive in this area as well.
Right. Mark, both you and I have spent some years of our lives at the IMF, so I want to end this discussion asking you a question on the IMF. Recently, I had Martin Mulheisen on my podcast. Martin used to be the director of the Strategic Policy Review Department in the IMF, recently retired. And he seemed to be a bit uneasy about a middle of the road conservative multilateral organization like the IMF being increasingly tasked with dealing with climate change issues or gender or inequality and so on. So Martin, of course, thinks these are important issues. It just feels that the IMF has been successful being narrow and focused on balance of payments, on fiscal, and that's where most of the energy of the organization should be. Your thoughts?
So this is complicated terrain. Martin Mulheisen is a wonderful, thoughtful individual, and I commend you for having him. I'm sure he was a great guest. Let me just make one general observation, which Martin wouldn't make, but it would be kind of the observation somebody like me would make, because I wasn't in IMF staff. I was representing a shareholder. And, ultimately, the IMF is a shareholder organization. It's remained relevant and been successful because it has adapted to what shareholders wanted over time. Soviet Union collapses, we throw the IMF in there to do all the economic research. That's what the shareholders wanted. We wanted the IMF to get involved in, dealing with debt issues, solving emerging market debt crises. We wanted the IMF to go into low-income countries. So it does it. So it is responsive to shareholders, and the whole world is seized with climate issues, for example, these days. So, I think it's appropriate for the IMF to head in this direction, so long as it's consistent with its mandate and done in a reasonable way. So, what is reasonable? Well, research is one thing. Research by the IMF on carbon pricing, I think, has been very good and useful. Climate can be a macro critical issue. You can imagine small island economy. This is something they've got to factor into their budget. And, everybody jokes that the IMF stands for, it's mostly fiscal. So I think that if it's defined in this macro critical way, to use a somewhat nebulous but semi-meaningful term in the context of the IMF, there is a role for climate. There may be a role for equity. I'm less convinced of that, but there are no doubt important issues there. So again, it should be consistent with the mandate. The fund should not be doing what the World Bank does. The IMF should be focused on stabilization. It should be focused on the relevant structural reforms that go along with areas like fiscal, etc. But I think that it can play a role. It's not black or white. It's a shade of gray, and whether it's charcoal or light, I think that's an issue that still needs to be sorted out.
Very, very nuanced. That's great. Thank you so much, Mark, for your time and insights.
It's been fun. Always a pleasure to see you, and hopefully the next time I see you, we will not have a 12 or 13-hour bridge between us.
It will be wonderful, and I look forward to that, hopefully in April. Let me also thank our listeners on a concluding note. Kopi Time was produced by Martin Tuckey, Daisy Sharma, and Violet Lee provided additional assistance. It is for information only and does not represent any trade ideas or recommendations. All 69 episodes of Kopi Time are available on YouTube and on all major podcast platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify. As for our research publications, webinars, and live streams, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.